Hello, everybody, and welcome to Sharpening Your Skills with CloudAhoy. Myself and the rest of the team are so happy to be at EAA AirVenture in 2021. My name is Ty Schuff, and I am the customer liaison at CloudAhoy. My role gives me the opportunity to work with all of our customers, big and small. I currently hold a private pilot license with an instrument rating and am slowly working towards both my commercial and instructor ratings. Today, we are going to spend some time with an overview of what CloudAhoy is and then move on to how it can help you be a more proficient pilot. I will then move on to some examples of using CloudAhoy for training, and then briefly discuss what a debrief looks like when we get access to rich data. Before we get started, I want to talk a little bit about currency and proficiency. To me, these are similar but very different things. In my eyes, currency answers the question, am I legal? Have I logged the appropriate number of takeoffs and landings? Have I logged my holds and approaches? Have I had my flight review? These values can be measured very easily, and several tools exist for this today. Proficiency, on the other hand, answers the question, am I safe? When I think of proficiency, I think of questions like, how stable was that approach? Did I hold my altitude well during the cruise? Or even, what were my entry and exit headings on my third steep turn? Answering the question, how proficient am I, is a bit more difficult than just counting landings and approaches. It requires us to look at how well we flew on multiple flights and look for trends in our flying. Today, I plan on exploring this idea in a bit more depth using CloudAhoy. So what exactly is CloudAhoy? Well, CloudAhoy is a tool for performing data-driven post-flight debriefs. Our goal is to help create safer and more proficient pilots at all experience levels. CloudAhoy is used by both Part 141 and Part 61 flight schools, independent CFIs, professional pilots, recreational pilots, the U.S. Air Force, and more. It's often easier to show what CloudAhoy is than try to explain it. To do this, let's take a look at a debrief for your typical $100 Hamburger flight. This is a flight that I flew from Beverly, Massachusetts to Poughkeepsie, New York. The conditions were marginal VFR, which necessitated shooting the VOR runway 24 approach. During this approach, we will introduce the key trend that I'm always focusing on, airspeed management. The flight loads as we cross the final approach fix, the Kingston VOR. This approach was automatically identified and scored by CloudAhoy. In the top left corner is a 2D depiction of my flight path as well as an overlay for the approach. The top right corner has a 3D cockpit view of my flight, which includes the flight path vector. On the bottom is the segment information view, which gives me access to the raw data from the approach. I can see that I overshot my turn to final as I crossed the VOR. Keep an eye on the flight path vector as I work to get myself reestablished on final. This bug is a great way to visualize just how stable the approach was. Clicking on the score, I can see a breakdown of the data behind this approach. My airspeed below 1,000 feet scored well, though I would have liked to have been closer to 90 knots. Below 500 feet, however, I was well below the 75 knots I intended to fly and even fell below 65 knots a couple of times. This is a trend that I often see on my approaches that I need to correct. Overall, the approach was flown fine, but I think it could have been a lot better. One of the questions I always get is, where does the data come from? CloudAhoy is able to ingest data from many different sources. We publish apps for both iOS and Android. We can accept data from several electronic flight bags like 4Flight and Garmin Pilot, or you can even use a portable GPS device. We're even able to accept data from flight simulators and directly from aircraft avionics like the Garmin G1000. We take this flight data and combine it with several published sources, including information about aerodromes, published approaches, wind data from NOAA, and aircraft V-speeds. All of this is combined and run through our powerful analyzer, which automatically segments a flight and provides objective scoring for many maneuvers. Let's explore segmentation and scoring by looking at another flight. The next flight is one that I flew last year after a 3-month gap without flying. My goal was to go up and focus on the basics, get comfortable with the aircraft, and knock out my daytime currency requirements. It was also an excuse to fly along the coast on a beautiful day. The flight loads in the maneuver analysis default layout with a 3D track view on the left, 2D overview on the bottom right, and the segment information view on the top right. All of the segments identified and scored by CloudAhoy can be found on the left side of the screen. We will start by taking a look at the 2 steep turns which scored a 57 and an 81. Clicking on the right steep turn advances the timeline and zooms in on the maneuver. This maneuver only scored a 57. As we look at graphs in the segment information view, we can see my altitude and airspeed. Both of these graphs have sections highlighted in red, which indicate that I was outside of the scoring envelope, plus or minus 100 in the case of altitude, and plus or minus 10 for the case of airspeed. If I expand the score, I can see that my altitude peaked at 152 feet above my entry altitude, while my airspeed bottomed out about 16 knots low. A solid needs improvement grade on this maneuver, if you ask me. Advancing to the steep left turn, I can see that my altitude was improved significantly, but my airspeed suffered. I probably should have added a touch more power as I rolled into the turn. This turn was flown better, but could still use improvement, something to remember the next time I go up. Now on to the approaches. On the approach into Portsmouth, we can see that I was around 75 knots on my final approach. I want to draw attention to my altitude, highlighted in green though. It looks like I started the approach shallow and really dove in at the end, going well below the computed average glide path. While I can definitely work on the consistency of my descent, I'm overall pretty happy with this approach. The approach into Lawrence shows more inconsistencies with my airspeed. I was a little bit slow, and then a little bit fast, and then very slow. Finally, my approach into Beverly was the best of the bunch, with great speed management and altitude management all the way down. Automatic segmentation and scoring has helped us to look at this hour-long flight in a relatively short amount of time. In practice, it only took me 3 minutes to debrief this flight after I flew it. I jotted down some notes about my steep turns and my approaches, and I made it a point to work on it the next time I went up flying. Let's take a break for a moment and talk about how to sign up for CloudAhoy. We offer 2 paid tiers, Pro and Standard, as well as a free tier. All new users will get a 35-day free trial of CloudAhoy Pro that starts when you upload your first flight. No credit card is required for the trial. Head over to cloudahoy.com to sign up. Now that we've covered the basics of CloudAhoy, we can talk a little bit more about Proficiency. I would imagine there isn't a single pilot out there who wasn't impacted by COVID-19 in some way. I personally only flew about 20 hours last year, which was down from my average of over 100 hours in years prior. In addition, as the pandemic grew at the end of last year, I made the decision to stop flying altogether until things slowed down. Today, I find myself getting ready for my flight review so that I can be airborne again. I'm a huge advocate of desktop flight simulators to stay proficient. As I'm preparing for my flight review, I've been spending more time in my simulator applying the lessons I learned debriefing past real-world flights. I run both major simulators and believe in flying the sim as close to the real thing as possible. As a result, I debrief every flight with CloudAhoy in addition to using services like ForeFlight and PilotEdge. One of the flights I've been looking at recently was an IFR Currency flight I flew last September. During this flight, I logged all of the requirements to remain IFR current, including 6 approaches. This flight was also a good test of my flight chops as it was a warm, bumpy day with a lot of radio chatter just north of Boston. Loading this debrief, I can see all the approaches were automatically identified in score, as well as overlays placed for each of the approach paths. My scores were all in the green, which is great, but I've learned that there's always something I can learn from my approaches. There were 3 approaches I wanted to look at following this flight. Let's start by taking a look at the VOR approach into the Skyhaven Airport. Clicking on the checkbox next to the approach will declutter the view so that only that approach is shown. I can then zoom in on the approach by clicking on it. There are 2 altitudes that I'm looking at in addition to my airspeed. I should be above 2,000 feet crossing Bover and above 1,020 feet crossing MAB KV. Scrubbing forward on the timeline, I can see my airspeed come down as I put in a notch of flaps and approach the final approach fix at 2,000 feet. My airspeed held nicely at 90 knots on the way down. However, I ended up 40 feet below the MAB KV crossing restriction, and my airspeed started climbing well above the 90-knot target approach speed as I initiated my missed approach. I now know that I need to spend some time managing speed and altitude during the level-off portion of a non-precision approach. The next approach I want to look at is the ILS-16 into Portsmouth. Fatigue was starting to set in as I was performing my 4th approach without much of a break. During this approach, I was slow just inside the final approach fix, and overcompensated a bit, ending up fast as I crossed 1,000 feet AGL. My speed remained fast until I got down to 500 feet where I finally got it under control. This approach also shows the CDI and glide slope gauges as calculated by CloudAhoy. These gauges show me that I tracked the localizer and glide slope pretty well, only getting a bit high at the end as I started to execute my missed approach. The last approach I want to look at was the localizer approach into Beverly. This approach felt very good, though fatigue was definitely setting in and it was quite bumpy, a fact that was evident by looking at the flight path vector. Expanding the scoring pane, I can see that I nailed my airspeed and course, but had some inconsistencies in my sink rate and descent angle. Like any skilled pilot, I'll blame the turbulence. All of the flights you've seen today were recording using only GPS position data. I record my flights on a yoke-mounted iPad running ForeFlight. My GPS source is a combination of the internal GPS and Garmin's flight stream, depending on which aircraft I'm flying. When using only GPS data, CloudAhoy will compute and estimate parameters like the pilot's indicated airspeed, pitch, roll, and more. The last couple of flights have been flown specifically for currency and evaluated for proficiency. The next flight is a short cross-country that I flew in my club's Cessna 182. I opted to fly rather than drive because it was a Friday afternoon and traffic around Boston can be absolutely brutal. What a joy it was flying over that traffic. I've set up this flight to look at the 2D path overlaid on top of a VFR chart. I want to review my lateral path to make sure I was well clear of the 2,000-foot Bravo shelf just inside of my track. I also wanted to look at my altitude and make sure that I stayed close to my target of 2,800 feet, which avoids both the 3,000-foot Bravo shelf above me and the 2,600-foot Delta ceiling below me. A quick scrub of the whole flight, and I can see that my lateral position and altitude were exactly where I wanted them. No FSDO call for me this time. I'll zoom in on the approach and change the view to a satellite view. My first observation on this approach is that I was pretty tight on my downwind leg, which led to a rounded base leg rather than a squared one. Definitely a mental note for next time. Expanding the scoring details, I can see a few problems that need to be addressed. My sink rate and descent rate were very inconsistent. This can be seen on the graph as well. I was very high as I turned final and had to execute a slip to get down onto the glide path. This is another trend I have identified with my own flying and have spent quite a bit of time in both the plane and the simulator working on it. After this flight, I made a note to work on my downwind to base to final legs the next time I went up in the 182. I'm going to get on my soapbox for a moment and tell you that you should debrief every single flight. I'm saying that not just because that's what I'm paid to do, but also because I believe there is something that can be learned from every single flight flown. Doing this will help you identify trends, identify repeated mistakes, and look for bad habits that you may have formed in your flying. One of my coworkers, Brittany Tuff, shared a flight recently. Brittany suspected that she was having problems establishing and maintaining the centerline on final. She put all 4 approaches from her flight side by side and was able to confirm her suspicion using CloudAhoy's automatic scoring. The centerline score is something Britt always looks at as she believes it's a great indicator of the approach quality, just as I tend to focus on my airspeed and my altitude. By debriefing for proficiency, pilots can develop a focus for future instruction. CloudAhoy helps you create a checklist of items to cover the next time you talk to your instructor. Speaking of instructors, next we'll talk a little bit about how CloudAhoy can help on training flights. Segmentation and automatic scoring can really help to enhance pilot instruction. Scoring gives both pilot and instructor a big picture view of the flight. It allows you to immediately see all of the maneuvers and how well they scored, giving you an easy way to drill down to those that require closer attention. Automatic scoring does not replace the CFI, however. We all know that flying is more than just tracking needles and looking at your airspeed. One of our friends, Nate Weinsaft, wisely said, CloudAhoy tells the pilot what happened, and a flight instructor tells the pilot why it happened. To illustrate how segmentation and scoring can help to quickly look at a training flight, let's take a look at some pattern work. This was one of my early pre-solo training flights where I flew 11 laps in the pattern with my instructor at Lawrence Airport. Loading up this debrief, we can see all of the approaches and their scores on the left. You can see some degradation in the scores followed by some improvement. Let's start by looking at the first approach. Even back in 2017, I was flying my approaches a bit on the slow side. This approach had a 0. After a series of approaches that got worse, I finally scored above a 70 and had an approach I felt good about. My airspeed management was much better, though my centerline tracking and descent angle still needed some work. The highest scoring approach on this flight was actually flown by my instructor. You can see that he is much better at maintaining a smooth, consistent approach speed and angle. The last approach that was flown is the last one for a reason. My speed was consistent but slow, and I find myself over-controlling the airplane, which resulted in my descent angle being all over the place. We decided at this point to end the flight and head back to the FBO. By using CloudAhoy, we could have easily looked at the key approaches and noted the issues I had, as well as demonstrate the difference between my instructor's smooth flying and my less than smooth flying. CloudAhoy can accept not just GPS data, but also rich data from many avionics packages. To date, we have seen several flight schools integrate with us by sending data from their G1000 avionics directly. We have also had pilots uploading data from other Garmin avionics, such as the G3000, G3X, and G5, as well as those using Avidon, Dynon, and far more. Pilots flying in Redbird simulators can have their data automatically uploaded after each flight, making it possible to debrief their flight immediately and then reconfigure and fly the same approach all over again. Finally, flights can be uploaded to CloudAhoy automatically using AirSync. AirSync uses cellular networks to automatically upload flights to CloudAhoy as they are completed. Your debrief can be ready the moment you walk into the FBO. Let's take a look at a flight imported directly from a G1000. This flight was an instrument flight flown in a Cessna 172. I'm including an additional graph at the bottom which shows the engine's RPM reading. The pilot was using autopilot for this flight, but still had to manage power. You can see on the segment information view where the speed was a bit fast and the pilot pulled power to slow down. The RPM indication can also be seen in real time on the 3D cockpit view. In addition to RPM, we can also see several other indications like EGT, CHT, and more. Clicking on EGT, for example, will show a graph of all 4 cylinder exhaust temperatures. The last flight we will look at today is flown in a Redbird simulator. This flight is one of the scenarios offered in the Pilot Proficiency Center. It's deep practice. CloudAhoy has access to all of the same data from the simulator that we would have in the real airplane. In addition to the RPM indications from the previous flight, we can also see the flaps position. During this flight, we can see that the speed and altitude were very well controlled, and then at flaps 30, the speed comes down nicely as the pilot lands just past the numbers. In closing, we stay current to be legal, and we stay proficient to be safe. There is value in debriefing every flight, as there is always something to learn. These were examples of how I use CloudAhoy to help maintain my own proficiency as a weekend warrior. Myself and the rest of the team look forward to helping you and everyone else in the aviation industry become better and safer pilots by taking advantage of data-driven debriefing after each flight. As a reminder, you can try CloudAhoy free for 35 days by signing up at cloudahoy.com. No credit card is required, and your trial time does not start until you log your first flight. Over the past several years, we've had the joy of working with several organizations throughout the aviation industry. CloudAhoy's analysis engine helps to provide scoring via the EAA Skill Score Tracker. We also work with Star Aviation and Sporty's Pilot Shop. Purdue University and Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University are working to integrate CloudAhoy into their lesson plans. And finally, we're thrilled to be working with Citation Jet pilots on some great projects to come in the future. If you have any questions about CloudAhoy, please feel free to reach out to team@cloudahoy.com or click on the feedback button in the top left corner of every debrief. We also have an extensive help repository that can answer many of the questions you might have. Once again, thank you very much for taking the time to listen to this presentation. If you're attending AirVenture this year, please stop by our booth at Hangar C and say hello. Thank you again.